On Thanksgiving night, my son leaned across the table and said, "We don't need your advice anymore. Stop pretending you matter." The room went still, but only for a breath. Then came the laughter, soft at first, then louder, overlapping like waves hitting a shore. It wasn't the kind of laughter that carried warmth. No, it was sharp, brittle, made of glass meant to cut. The clinking of silverware resumed, chairs scraped against the floor, and I realized the feast that should have been a celebration had turned into a trial, and I was the only one standing in the defendant's box. I tried to ignore it, to steady my hands on the table, but every gesture from them felt rehearsed. My son-in-law's smirk as he lifted his glass, my daughter's careful avoidance of my eyes, her attention locked instead on folding and refolding her napkin. Even my grandson's snicker as he typed something into the glowing group chat on his phone, a chat I wasn't part of, one they didn't even bother hiding anymore. Notifications buzzed in rhythm, and I could feel the inside jokes ricocheting from screen to screen, cutting me out of the very family I had once built brick by brick. I cleared my throat, my voice heavier than I expected. "Be careful with loans you don't understand," I said slowly, choosing each word like a stone placed on a bridge. I wanted to give them something solid, a warning that could hold their weight if they ever slipped. But before the second sentence could form, my son-in-law's voice sliced through the air. "Here we go again," he chuckled, raising his fork like a gavel. "The professor of life lessons. Tell us again how the world used to work back when gas was $1 and phones had wires." The laughter rose louder this time, not even subtle. Someone actually clapped. My cheeks burned, not from shame, but from the memory of every time I had been here before, trying to protect them, only to be mocked for it. I looked at my daughter then, hoping to find some flicker of loyalty, but she lowered her head, her lips tightening as if to seal away any defense she might have spoken. She couldn't even meet my gaze. Betrayal doesn't always come with shouts. It sometimes comes in the quiet refusal of an ally to stand beside you. Around me the conversation shifted, faster now, voices bouncing over mine. Plans for trips they couldn't afford, investments they didn't understand, arguments about who would get what once the old man finally stopped controlling things. They spoke as if I wasn't there, as if my chair had been emptied years ago. That was the moment I stopped talking. Not because I had nothing left inside me, but because I understood the weight of silence. They thought I surrendered, that I had accepted my irrelevance. But I wasn't beaten. I was recording. Every smirk, every word dripping with arrogance, every shallow laugh. They became etched into me like lines of testimony in a courtroom that hadn't yet opened its doors. I looked at each of them one by one, holding my tongue as the noise of their chatter filled the room. My silence wasn't weakness, it was memory. It was preparation. They believed advice was worthless, that my years of sweat and struggle were jokes to be tossed aside with their empty wine glasses. What they didn't know was that long before this night, long before these insults, I'd already written my answer. It sat in an office downtown, in a folder marked Trust. And in that folder, in ink that would outlive their laughter, was my signature, the only word they could never talk over. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments where you're listening from. Has something like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now we continue. Silence is never empty. It lingers long after the voices die down, heavier than any argument, louder than any insult. After that night at the table, I carried it with me like an invisible burden, one that pressed against my chest each time I overheard their plans, spoken behind half-closed doors. They thought I had surrendered, that my quiet meant defeat. But silence was a lens, and through it I began to see everything more clearly than before. Their words were filled with numbers they barely understood, promises they couldn't possibly keep. Fast loans whispered about as if they were gifts, contracts signed with shaky hands, investments discussed in the same careless tone one might use for a holiday purchase. I saw the brochures scattered across the kitchen, homes in places they had never even visited, cars with glossy paint and empty warranties. They convinced themselves that life was a game of shortcuts, that speed could replace patience, that risk was the same thing as courage. I saw my son-in-law smile as he laid down papers for my daughter to sign, his eyes glittering not with love but with calculation. He spoke of opportunities, of money multiplying overnight, as though fortune was a faucet you could turn on at will. My daughter, tired of hearing me warn, leaned into his confidence as though it was truth. I caught the hesitation in her eyes, brief, fleeting, but she buried it, preferring to believe him instead of me. After all, I was the one they had all agreed to stop listening to. My grandson, too young to understand, was dragged into it. They placed contracts before him, urging him to sign, telling him this was family responsibility, that his name meant something. He held the pen nervously, his handwriting still uneven, and I saw how easily they turned innocence into collateral. They did not see the weight of those papers. They only saw quick solutions dressed up as triumphs. I tried once more to speak, quietly, not as a lecture, not as a scolding. I chose my words with care, softer than before. Every loan comes with a shadow. Every signature is a chain. That was all I said, but even that was too much. My son-in-law's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "You can keep your shadows," he muttered, brushing me aside. My daughter didn't even look up from her papers. So I stopped. I watched. I let them build their fragile tower out of borrowed bricks and unearned confidence. They thought I was irrelevant, that my silence was emptiness. But silence was memory. It held every detail, every risk ignored, every arrogance displayed. I memorized the way my daughter's hand trembled when she signed, the way my son-in-law hid his unease beneath loud certainty, the way my grandson hesitated before pressing his name into a page that would one day haunt him. It hurt to see it. It hurt more than their laughter. Watching them destroy themselves in slow motion, knowing I had the knowledge to stop it, but not the permission. It was like standing on the shore while the people you love sail straight into a storm, waving at you as if the thunder was applause. And yet, I endured it. Because some lessons cannot be handed down in words. Some lessons must arrive through consequence, through time, through the cold echo of reality when the noise finally fades. I knew that when the storm broke, when the towers they built collapsed into dust, they would remember every warning I had tried to give. They would recall my silence, not as weakness, but as judgment. And then, only then, would they learn the cost of mocking what they refused to understand. The price of silence is high. It demands patience. It demands pain. But in the end, it is never the one who stays quiet who pays it. It is those who mistake silence for absence, who confuse patience for surrender, who discover that time collects every debt with interest. There are wounds sharper than words, and some of them come dressed as meetings you're not invited to. It began quietly, like all betrayals do. My son-in-law announced a family council, his voice bright and commanding, as if he had been born with the right to gather them, to decide for them, to lead them. I was in the kitchen, washing my hands from the work of the day, when I heard the words fall like stones into the air. Family council, but not for me. I stepped closer to the hallway, listening, my body still, my breathing careful. My daughter didn't say my name. She didn't even argue. Instead, she busied herself pouring coffee, placing mugs on the table with the same hands that once reached for mine when she was afraid of storms. Now those hands obeyed another voice. She moved quickly, as if efficiency could cover the discomfort, as if serving coffee could drown out the guilt of excluding her own father. She never lifted her eyes. She couldn't. "Dad's tired," I heard her murmur once, so soft it almost didn't exist. A lie used like a blanket to cover something sharp. Tired? No, I wasn't tired. I was awake, wide awake, watching every brick of trust they pulled from the foundation we had once built together. I told myself to breathe, to keep steady. I carried the trash outside, because when a man is left behind, sometimes even simple chores become a shield against humiliation. The cold air bit my skin as I walked across the yard, the bag heavy in my hand, though not as heavy as the silence pressing against me from the walls I had built to shelter them. I stood for a long moment under the night sky, staring at the stars, wondering how children could grow so far from the roots that once fed them. When I returned, the circle had already closed. They sat huddled together around the dining table, voices hushed but steady, their heads bent toward one another as if they were conspiring against a stranger instead of sharing blood with the man who had carried them through winters and storms. Papers lay spread out before them, contracts, brochures, figures scribbled in the margins. The smell of coffee filled the air, but it was bitter, not comforting. It smelled of deals made in shadows, of decisions forged in betrayal. I lingered in the doorway, unnoticed. My daughter glanced at me for a fraction of a second, but her gaze darted away immediately, as if meeting my eyes would have shattered the fragile wall she had built around her loyalty. My grandson scrolled on his phone, nodding absently at something his stepfather said, as if he belonged to a new order where my voice carried no weight. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, speaking with the confidence of a man who mistook manipulation for leadership. They all listened, not to me, to him. The circle was closed. Not broken, not missing, just deliberately closed to keep me out. I didn't speak. Words had no place here. They would have bounced against the walls of their certainty and fallen lifeless to the floor. So I turned away, my footsteps heavy, the smell of coffee following me down the hall like smoke after a fire. I sat alone in my room, staring at the faded photographs on the dresser. Moments when laughter had been real, when family had meant arms open, not doors shut. It was in that silence I realized something brutal. Exclusion isn't always about absence. Sometimes it's deliberate erasure. They hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen to remove me. And in that choice, they revealed everything. The circle without me wasn't a family council. It was a performance of unity, built on the illusion that my years of sacrifice could be erased by a single evening's decision. But they were wrong. They mistook the warmth of coffee for the strength of roots. They mistook betrayal for progress. They mistook silence for surrender. And while they signed papers and nodded in agreement, I remembered the folder locked away downtown, where a different kind of circle had been drawn long ago. A circle of names, of conditions, of boundaries I had set with care, not arrogance. A circle they couldn't erase, no matter how tightly they closed their own. The house smelled of coffee that night, yes, but beneath it was the stench of betrayal, and no perfume, no polite laughter, no forced counsel could disguise it. Night has a way of stripping everything down to its bones. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if even the walls were ashamed of the voices they had contained earlier that day. I sat at the old desk in my room, the lamp casting a pale circle of light on a blank sheet of paper. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of all the words I had swallowed at the table, all the warnings left unheard. I began to write, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the clarity that comes only when you've been silenced too many times. I wrote to them the things they refused to hear, how numbers are not just figures but promises, how a signature is not decoration, but a chain that binds the soul to responsibility. I wrote about debt, not as ink on a page, but as a shadow that follows you, growing darker with every careless decision. I reminded them that every quick profit has a price, and that every door they force open with arrogance closes twice as fast behind them. The words flowed like confession. I told them what it had taken me a lifetime to learn, that responsibility is not something you inherit by blood, but something you earn by sacrifice. That money does not forgive ignorance. That trust, once broken, is harder to rebuild than any house. And that laughter at another man's wisdom is the cheapest coin they would ever spend. I wrote about dignity, about patience, about the way silence does not mean absence, but endurance. At one point I paused, staring at the ink drying on the page. My mind drifted to memories of my daughter as a child, sitting at this very desk, practicing her handwriting. Back then, she used to turn to me for guidance, her little voice asking if each letter was formed correctly. And I had answered, always patient, always steady. Now her hand signed papers without me, and the letters she formed could undo everything I had once built. The memory burned, but it also sharpened me. I wrote on line after line until the paper was crowded with truths too heavy for their ears. Each sentence became both a warning and a verdict, words etched in ink instead of voice. There was no mockery here, no interruption, no dismissive smirk. The page listened faithfully without judgment. It let me be heard in a way they never allowed me at the table. But when I finished, when the lamp flickered slightly, as if testing my resolve, I didn't fold the paper. I didn't seal it in an envelope or leave it on the kitchen counter for them to find in the morning. I placed it in the drawer, unfinished and unsent. Because sometimes the most powerful argument is not the one you hand over, but the one you keep. A letter withheld is not weakness, it is restraint. It waits, it lingers, it gains weight with time. I left it there, in the drawer, a silent witness. It was more than paper. It was proof. Proof that I had tried. Proof that I had spoken, even if only to the night. One day, I knew, the words would either be discovered or remembered. And when that day came, they would realize that silence had not been emptiness. It had been preparation. The letter sat like a stone in the dark, hidden but unmovable. And I, alone in the night, understood that the sharpest blade is sometimes the one still in its sheath. There are truths that live in silence, hidden in the rhythm of small repairs, in the unnoticed work of hands that refuse to let a home collapse. In the days after the council I was excluded from, I found myself moving quietly through the house, fixing what was broken, patching what was frayed, holding together what no one else even saw coming apart. A leaking pipe under the sink, dripping steadily into the dark wood, a flickering bulb in the hallway, casting uncertain shadows each time they passed. A loose floorboard groaning under careless footsteps. Small things, perhaps, but small things rot a house when left undone. I took up the hammer, the wrench, the ladder, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something older. I had built this house with the same patience I had built them, nail by nail, sacrifice by sacrifice. And though they dismissed me now, though they laughed at my words and closed their circle without me, still I kept the walls upright, still I kept the light burning. They did not thank me, they did not even notice, but the house did. Each nail I drove into the wood was more than a repair. It was memory. The same way I once corrected their small mistakes, steadying their trembling hands as they learned to write their names, binding their wounds after careless falls, covering their debts of inexperience with my own labor. I remembered nights of sitting by their bedsides when fevers raged, when shadows frightened them, when their cries pierced the dark. Back then, they believed my presence was safety itself. Now, they believed my presence was an inconvenience. Still, the hammer fell. Still, the nails held. There was one evening when the rain came hard, rattling the windows, seeping through a crack in the roof. They slept soundly, unaware of the water trickling down the walls. I climbed the ladder in the storm, the shingles slick under my feet, my hands raw from the cold, and I sealed the breach. No one stirred. No one saw. In the morning the ceiling was dry, the walls unmarked. They poured their coffee and spoke of their plans, never pausing to wonder why the house had not drowned them in the night. That was the story of my silence. It held them when they didn't even know they were falling. The house became my witness. Each corner, each board, each repaired hinge whispered back to me in its own way. It knew who kept it alive, who patched its wounds, who steadied its bones. It knew that the laughter at the dinner table did not build walls, that signatures on careless contracts did not seal windows against the wind. It knew the truth they refused to see, that endurance is invisible until it disappears, and by then it is always too late. They mistook my silence for absence. They mistook their comfort for self-sufficiency. But comfort is not born of arrogance. It is built by the quiet persistence of someone willing to mend what others leave to ruin. The house understood. Every creak, every nail, every light that still shone because my hand had turned the bulb. I lived in the background, moving through the shadows, steadying a life they believed needed no hand but their own. And though no one thanked me, though no one noticed, I knew. I knew that without those nails, without those unseen repairs, the roof would sag, the walls would bow, the light would fade. They would lose the home they had mistaken for permanence. And when that day came, when the house, like my silence, revealed what had always been true, they would understand. Too late, perhaps, but they would. For now, I carried the hammer, the nails, the patience. For now, I let the house remember, even if they would not. Memory does not always come softly. Sometimes it strikes like lightning, unannounced, searing the mind with a moment long buried but never forgotten. One evening, while the house hummed with the careless noise of their chatter, my eyes drifted to an old drawer in my desk, the same one that held the unsent letter. And in that moment the memory surfaced, sharp and clear. The day I had walked into the lawyer's office years before, when the air smelled of polished wood and ink, and every folder seemed heavy with lives yet to be lived. I remembered the room, orderly shelves, the faint ticking of a clock, the precise movements of the lawyer as he placed documents before me one by one. He did not speak with the arrogance of my children or the smug certainty of my son-in-law. His voice was measured, patient, respectful, as though he understood that what we were building that day was not simply paper, it was protection. We had spoken at length about my wishes, about the difference between possession and purpose. I told him I wanted the things I had built, my work, my savings, the house that still held the echo of my wife's laughter, to serve more than greed. I wanted them to carry dignity forward, to reward responsibility, to remind the generations after me that inheritance is not entitlement but stewardship. He nodded carefully, asking questions, clarifying, ensuring no clause could be twisted, no loophole exploited by hands that would one day forget the sacrifices behind the ink. The pages were many. Each carried a condition, each one a boundary, each one a safeguard against arrogance. I wrote into those documents the lessons my children refused to hear at the table, that money without wisdom is poison, that leadership without humility is theft, that family without respect is only strangers under one roof. I built a structure where selfishness would fail, where recklessness would be excluded, where only those who had proven loyalty, kindness, and patience would hold the keys. At last, the lawyer turned to the final page. The paper was crisp, its space waiting for a mark that would turn words into law. My hand did not tremble. I signed not in haste, not in bitterness, but in calm certainty. The letters of my name stretched across the page with the weight of years behind them. The hours I had worked, the nights I had gone without, the sacrifices I had made silently so they could live with comfort. My signature was not ink alone. It was the story of a lifetime pressed into a single line. When I pushed the paper back across the desk, the lawyer placed it neatly into the folder and closed it with a quiet finality. I remember the sound of that folder snapping shut. It was not the sound of endings. It was the sound of protection sealed, of truth preserved against time and betrayal. Years have passed since that day. Dust must lie thick on that folder now, stacked away in some drawer at the law office, overlooked and forgotten by everyone except me. But I know what rests inside. Beneath that dust is not just a contract, it is a shield that waits for the moment when arrogance finally collides with consequence, a shield written in my own steady hand. They laugh at me now. They mock my silence, dismiss my presence, call my advice obsolete. They build their fragile kingdoms of debt and pride, blind to the storm gathering above them. But when the time comes, and it will, the laughter will fall silent. The debts will come due, and the lawyer will open that folder. And there, on the last page, they will see my name. Calm, certain, unshaken. My signature waits like a verdict under dust, patient as stone. They cannot erase it. They cannot laugh it away. And when it speaks, it will speak louder than all their jeers combined. Pride has a way of pretending to be unbreakable. But even the strongest mask begins to fracture when reality presses too hard. It started quietly, with restless footsteps in the hallway at night, with hushed voices behind doors that no longer carried laughter but urgency. Their great project, the one they paraded around the table as if it were the golden road to wealth, began to choke under its own weight. Deadlines slipped, payments piled, promises from business partners vanished like smoke. The excitement that once dripped from their words was gone, replaced by a bitterness they tried to hide beneath louder boasts. But I saw it. I saw it in the way my son-in-law's shoulders stiffened, in the way my daughter's smile cracked too easily, in the way their conversations ended the moment I entered the room. And then, inevitably, they came to me. Not with humility, not with the kind of respect that asks, but with the tone of those who still believed themselves above me. They stood before me with folders and papers, their voices clipped, commanding, telling me what needed to be done. Their request was painted as a directive. They wanted my signature, not my wisdom, not my experience, not my presence, only the ink that would buy them more time, more credit, more rope to wrap around their own throats. I listened without interrupting, my silence steady, my gaze heavy. Inside, I felt the ache of recognition. This was not a plea for help, it was a demand for compliance. They had not come because they valued me. They had come because they were trapped, because the walls they built of arrogance were caving in, and they thought my hand could hold them up without consequence. When I finally spoke, I did not lecture. My voice was low, deliberate, carrying the weight of stone. I suggested transparency, simple, clean. Open the books, show where the money was going, show the risks, let honesty clear the air before deception suffocated everything. I did not accuse, I did not scold, I only offered clarity. But clarity was the last thing they wanted. My son-in-law's face tightened, his eyes narrowing, his words cutting like a blade cloaked in arrogance. Don't interfere, just sign. My daughter's silence behind him was worse than his tone. She stood there, her lips pressed thin, her hands clasped together, not meeting my eyes. She did not echo his words, but she did not stop them either. Her silence was agreement, her silence was betrayal. I looked at the papers they pushed toward me, the ink already bleeding with desperation. Contracts heavy with debt disguised as opportunity, clauses crafted to trap, promises that carried no safety net. They wanted my signature to buy them another illusion, to stitch another patch on a fabric already tearing apart. And in that moment I understood that nothing had changed since that Thanksgiving night. To them, I was still irrelevant until they needed the strength of my hand to fix what their pride had broken. But what they did not realize was that I had already signed something far greater, far stronger long ago. A signature they could not command, a decision they could not bend. My calm refusal to lift the pen that day was not silence. It was power. I let them see me set the papers back on the table, untouched, my hands steady, my eyes clear. I gave them no argument, no raised voice, no storm, only the immovable weight of refusal. And when I turned away, I felt the crack deepen in their confidence, because arrogance feeds on control, and nothing unsettles it more than the quiet strength of someone who does not bend. They would not admit it then, but I saw it. In the flicker of my son-in-law's forced grin, in the way my daughter's fingers trembled as she gathered the papers. Their golden project was not golden, it was rust, and they knew it. The cracks had begun to show, and once a wall begins to split, no amount of laughter or arrogance can keep it standing. Betrayal rarely comes dressed in open hostility. More often, it hides beneath polite words, polished smiles, and neatly stacked papers. It was a quiet afternoon when they brought me the folder. My daughter's hands held it as though it were nothing more than routine. An update, she said, her voice carefully even, too careful. Behind her, my son-in-law hovered like a shadow, his presence heavier than her words. The air carried the smell of coffee again, sharp and bitter, as if every plot in this house now required that same bitter ritual. They slid the papers toward me with the ease of those who had rehearsed this moment. It was nothing unusual, they insisted, just standard adjustments, a little house cleaning for the future, a matter of efficiency. But the weight of their insistence already betrayed them. No one insists this hard on something harmless. I reached for my glasses, the old pair with the scratched frame, and set them on the bridge of my nose. The room fell silent, though the silence was thick, uneasy, as though even they were afraid of the sound of my reading. I traced the lines carefully, each sentence slow, deliberate. Words, at first glance, innocent, revisions, updates, clarifications, but buried deep, smaller than the rest, crouched the truth. A clause tucked away in the shadows of the page, designed to slip unnoticed into permanence. A quiet theft written in legal language, transfer of rights, transfer of assets, a careful redirection of everything I had built, toward hands that had not earned, toward voices that had mocked, toward hearts that had long abandoned respect. I read on, past the trap, past the deception, until I reached the period that ended the page. Then I stopped. The weight of those words pressed against me, but it did not bend me. I removed my glasses slowly, folded them with the same care I had given to decades of sacrifice, and set them on the table beside the folder. My hand rested briefly on the paper, not in agreement, not in consent, but in acknowledgment of the cunning it carried. Then I pushed it back across the polished wood, its pages still empty of my ink, still lifeless without the one mark they wanted most. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. My daughter's eyes flickered, unable to meet mine. My son-in-law's jaw tightened, his smile breaking just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. They had expected compliance, a tired nod, a quick stroke of the pen. Instead, they received emptiness. My refusal was not spoken aloud. It was sharper than speech. It was the sound of absence, the absence of ink, the absence of surrender. I saw in their faces the truth they would never admit. They no longer sought family, they sought control. They had substituted meaning itself, what once was about trust, about protection, about care, had been twisted into greed, into acquisition, into theft disguised as efficiency. They no longer asked, what is right for all of us, but how do we take what we have not earned? And though they thought themselves clever, though they believed a line of small print could erase a lifetime of sacrifice, they forgot one thing. I had already been here before. I had seen shadows like these, men who thought they could bury truth under paper and signatures, and I had prepared. Long ago, in that lawyer's office, I had written protections they could not see, safeguards they could not touch. Their update was nothing more than an attempt to substitute my will with theirs, and it failed the moment I refused to lift the pen. I rose from the table without a word, leaving the folder untouched, my glasses still folded beside it. The weight of their disappointment filled the room, but I carried something heavier, the knowledge that their substitution had been exposed, that their performance of care had been unmasked as hunger. As I walked away, I thought of the letter in my drawer, unsent, and the trust in the lawyer's office, untouched, words and ink, both waiting. One day, I knew, they would learn that meaning cannot be rewritten by deceit, and when that day arrived, they would discover that the emptiest paper of all is the one they tried to fill with betrayal. Debt has a sound. It does not whisper. It pounds. It pounds on doors at dusk when the house is supposed to be wrapped in calm. It rattles the phone late at night with voices that have no patience for excuses. It hangs in the air like a second heartbeat, faster, more frantic, reminding everyone that time does not forgive, that promises written without thought always demand payment in full. I began to hear that sound in their footsteps, in the sharp way my son-in-law moved through the halls, in the restless tapping of my daughter's fingers against the kitchen counter. Their words grew shorter, clipped, and for the first time since their laughter had mocked me across the table, I saw something flicker behind their eyes. Fear. The storm they had built with their reckless hands had finally reached the shoreline. The great project they had spoken of as salvation was gasping, suffocating under bills and deadlines they could not outrun. Banks called, partners withdrew, promises crumbled. The same people who once dismissed my every word now found themselves staring at the edge of collapse, and in that collapse they turned toward me. But not with respect, not with humility. Their voices carried urgency, yes, but beneath it still lingered entitlement, the belief that my years of sacrifice were theirs to claim when convenient. They came into my room one evening, their movements hurried, their faces pale, and spread the papers across my table as if laying down cards in a final gamble. They did not joke this time. There was no laughter, no mocking tone. Instead, there was only desperation, their words tumbling over each other, ordering more than asking. They told me what needed to be done, how quickly I must act, how one signature could delay the storm long enough for them to breathe again. They spoke as if my silence these past months had been nothing but stubbornness, as if my hand was a tool they could command. I listened. I let their words wash over me, frantic and sharp, and when the room grew still enough, I spoke just once, only once. I told them, "Advice without ears is wind." The words left my mouth like stone, unmoved, unyielding. It was all I gave them. No lectures, no scolding, no anger, just the truth, that wisdom unheeded is as useless as air against a storm. Their faces hardened. My son-in-law's jaw clenched, his hands gathering the papers too quickly, as though the sound of refusal scorched his skin. My daughter turned away, her shoulders stiff, her silence screaming more than any accusation. And then, without another word, they left. The door slammed behind them, the echo resounding through the house like the final gavel of a trial that had never needed a jury. I sat in the quiet afterward, the storm of their anger fading into the night. They would leave blaming me, I knew. In their minds it was my refusal that chained them, my silence that betrayed them, my unwillingness to sign that had doomed their project. They could not yet face the truth, that it was not my pen, but their pride that had dragged them into debt. They would not admit that the storm was of their own making, that every broken promise, every shortcut, every mockery of caution had led them here. To them I was the villain, the obstacle, the man who abandoned them in their hour of need. But I knew better. I had warned them when laughter was still their shield. I had offered transparency before deceit buried them. I had lived through storms far harsher than theirs, storms that taught me the value of patience, the cost of arrogance. And when the rain passed, when the walls they trusted fell, it would not be my silence they remembered. It would be their own deafness. That night, I walked through the house alone, touching the walls I had built, listening to the quiet spaces between the creaks. The house stood firm, though the family within it had cracked. Money had spoken louder than love, louder than respect, louder than blood. And they had listened. But money, like debt, is a cruel master. It shouts until everything else is drowned out, until even family becomes a battlefield of blame. I let them leave in anger. I let them slam the door, because I knew that one day soon it would not be my silence that haunted them. It would be the sound of debt still pounding on their door, asking not for advice, not for love, not for family, but for payment. And by then, no signature of mine would save them. When the letter arrived, summoning us to the lawyer's office, the air in the house shifted. It was no longer filled with whispers of desperation, but with the brittle clang of false confidence. My son-in-law, clutching the envelope as though it were a ticket to salvation, announced it with the swagger of a man certain the tide had turned. My daughter stood beside him, nodding too quickly, her relief fragile but visible, as if she had convinced herself that one more meeting, one more signature, would finally put everything in order. The walls, heavy with the echoes of slammed doors and arguments, seemed to breathe easier for a moment. But I knew better. Letters from lawyers are never about rescue. They are about reckoning. The day of the meeting arrived gray and overcast, the kind of sky that carries neither storm nor sun, but hangs heavy, undecided, pressing down like judgment. We walked together into the building, though together meant nothing by then. They moved quickly, their shoes striking the polished floor with impatient confidence, speaking in clipped phrases, their heads held high as though they were already stepping into victory. I followed more slowly, my hand trailing along the cool wall of the corridor, my eyes catching the framed certificates and photographs of faces that smiled stiffly under plaques of authority. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and ink, of countless stories sealed in files no one else would ever read. As we waited outside the office door, their voices carried just loud enough to sting. "Once we sign, it's done," my son-in-law muttered, conviction sharpening each word. "We'll have it under control." My daughter nodded quickly, clutching her bag tighter, her eyes darting between him and the floor. Their confidence, once cracked, had been patched with denial, flimsy as paper, ready to tear at the slightest touch. I did not speak. I sat near the window, where the glass was streaked faintly from a morning rain. Beyond it, a row of trees stood tall, their branches stirring quietly in the breeze. I watched them as the voices around me swelled and dipped. The trees had stood there for decades, their roots hidden beneath the soil, unseen yet immovable. No passer-by could measure their depth. Yet it was the roots that decided whether the trees bent or stood when the storm came. I thought of my own roots, sacrifice buried in years of work, decisions made in silence, the ink of my signature pressed into paper long before these arguments ever began. Invisible, yes, but decisive. As I stared at the trees, I realized how much of life is like this. People noticing only what stands above ground, forgetting that everything lasting is held by what lies unseen. My family had dismissed me because they could not see my roots. They believed strength was in noise, in bold claims, in contracts waved about like banners. They never understood that true strength is quiet, that decisions made in calm long ago can outlast the loudest voices in the present. The office door opened then, and the lawyer's assistant beckoned us in. They surged forward, my son-in-law already straightening his tie, my daughter adjusting her hair, as though appearances would sway the weight of law. I remained still for a moment, letting them go ahead, watching the way they moved, eager, expectant, blind. Then slowly I rose from my chair and followed, casting one last look at the trees outside. Their branches swayed lightly in the wind, steady, unafraid. The roots hidden deep decided their fate. There, I stepped into the office knowing that my roots, too, had already decided everything. When the letter arrived, summoning us to the lawyer's office, the air in the house shifted. It was no longer filled with whispers of desperation, but with the brittle clang of false confidence. My son-in-law, clutching the envelope as though it were a ticket to salvation, announced it with the swagger of a man certain the tide had turned. My daughter stood beside him, nodding too quickly, her relief fragile but visible, as if she had convinced herself that one more meeting, one more signature, would finally put everything in order. The walls, heavy with the echoes of slammed doors and arguments, seemed to breathe easier for a moment. But I knew better. Letters from lawyers are never about rescue. They are about reckoning. The day of the meeting arrived gray and overcast, the kind of sky that carries neither storm nor sun but hangs heavy, undecided, pressing down like judgment. We walked together into the building, though together meant nothing by then. They moved quickly, their shoes striking the polished floor with impatient confidence, speaking in clipped phrases, their heads held high as though they were already stepping into victory. I followed more slowly, my hand trailing along the cool wall of the corridor, my eyes catching the framed certificates and photographs of faces that smiled stiffly under plaques of authority. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and ink, of countless stories sealed in files no one else would ever read. As we waited outside the office door, their voices carried just loud enough to sting. "Once we sign, it's done," my son-in-law muttered, conviction sharpening each word. "We'll have it under control." My daughter nodded quickly, clutching her bag tighter, her eyes darting between him and the floor. Their confidence, once cracked, had been patched with denial, flimsy as paper, ready to tear at the slightest touch. I did not speak. I sat near the window, where the glass was streaked faintly from a morning rain. Beyond it, a row of trees stood tall, their branches stirring quietly in the breeze. I watched them as the voices around me swelled and dipped. The trees had stood there for decades, their roots hidden beneath the soil, unseen yet immovable. No passerby could measure their depth, yet it was the roots that decided whether the trees bent or stood when the storm came. I thought of my own roots, sacrifice buried in years of work, decisions made in silence, the ink of my signature pressed into paper long before these arguments ever began. Invisible, yes, but decisive. As I stared at the trees, I realized how much of life is like this. People noticing only what stands above ground, forgetting that everything lasting is held by what lies unseen. My family had dismissed me because they could not see my roots. They believed strength was in noise, in bold claims, in contracts waved about like banners. They never understood that true strength is quiet, that decisions made in calm long ago can outlast the loudest voices in the present. The office door opened then, and the lawyer's assistant beckoned us in. They surged forward, my son-in-law already straightening his tie, my daughter adjusting her hair as though appearances would sway the weight of law. I remained still for a moment, letting them go ahead, watching the way they moved, eager, expectant, blind. Then, slowly, I rose from my chair and followed, casting one last look at the trees outside. Their branches swayed lightly in the wind, steady, unafraid. The roots hidden deep decided their fate. There, I stepped into the office knowing that my roots too had already decided everything. The lawyer's office smelled of paper and quiet authority, a space where truth was preserved not in memories or arguments, but in ink that refused to fade. We sat around the table, the heavy folder placed at its center like a stone altar. No one touched it at first. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair with forced ease, tapping his finger on the polished wood as if to remind himself of control. My daughter clasped her hands together in her lap, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the folder but never quite steady enough to meet it. I sat in silence, my gaze calm, waiting. The weight of the years was with me, a weight they had never carried, and it settled on my shoulders like armor. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable, and opened the folder. The sound of the clasp releasing was sharp, echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room. I saw my son-in-law flinch, only slightly, but enough to betray that his confidence was thinner than he wished. My daughter drew in a breath, shallow and quick, as if even the air had grown heavy. The rustle of the first page filled the space, and then came the voice, measured, unwavering, carrying no judgment, only fact. He began to read. The words were dry, legal, precise, but beneath them was a current stronger than any argument. He read of the trust's purpose, not indulgence, not consumption, not fleeting pleasures bought on credit, but preservation, stewardship, responsibility. The assets were not to serve whims, not to fund reckless ventures, not to dissolve into debts disguised as opportunity. They were bound to serve continuity, to build stability, to reward loyalty and sacrifice. Every clause cut through the silence like a knife. I heard my daughter swallow, the sound fragile and unguarded. She understood, even if she would not say it aloud. My son-in-law shifted again, his chair creaking under his weight, his fingers no longer tapping but curling into fists against the wood. Each sentence was another crack in the mask he wore, another stone falling from the fragile tower he had built of arrogance. Then the lawyer's voice slowed, deliberate as he reached the heart of it. Any amendment, any alteration, any transfer of rights or assets, he read, pausing between the words, requires the living, voluntary signature of the founder himself. And even then, only under the conditions that such changes serve the purpose of responsibility, protection, and service. Not consumption, not convenience. The room stilled. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on every chest. My daughter's head bowed lower, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. My son-in-law sat frozen, the words caught in his throat before they could form, his confidence shattered under the weight of the truth he had not expected. He had come here believing in shortcuts, in signatures he could coerce, in documents he could slip past me. He had mistaken the trust for a vault to be broken, not a foundation to be guarded. And now, with the lawyer's voice as witness, he discovered the wall he could not breach. I did not smile, nor did I gloat. My silence was the same silence I had carried through their mockery, through their slammed doors, through their desperate demands. It was the silence of certainty. I had prepared for this moment years ago, when I pressed my signature into the final page, knowing that one day arrogance would test the boundaries of loyalty. That day had come, and my ink, though long dried, was stronger than their words, stronger than their hunger, stronger than their pride. The lawyer turned another page, continuing his steady recital of boundaries, of structures, of protections, each one a stone laid carefully in the fortress I had built to shield not only the legacy, but the meaning of it. My family sat there, cornered, not by me, but by the truth they had chosen to ignore. For the first time in a long time, there were no interruptions, no mocking laughter, no dismissive waves of the hand. There was only silence, broken by the lawyer's voice and the faint sound of someone swallowing hard, trying to breathe beneath the weight of justice. I looked down at my hands, steady against the table. These were the same hands that had once held theirs when they were small, guiding them across streets, lifting them from falls, steadying them through fears. Those same hands had signed the trust. Those same hands now rested quietly, unmoved, while their illusions unraveled. And in that moment, I understood something profound. Justice does not always arrive with fury. Sometimes it arrives in the slow, deliberate reading of words written long ago, words that wait in silence until the world is ready to hear them. The papers continued to speak, and though my voice was absent, my presence filled the room. Every clause, every condition, every prohibition was me speaking through the years, reminding them that legacy is not a game, that inheritance is not a prize for arrogance, that silence, too, carries a voice when written in ink. And they listened now, not because they chose to, but because they could not escape it. The lawyer's voice did not tremble, nor did it rise. It carried the steady tone of a man who read what could not be argued with. His fingers turned another page, and then he paused, drawing in a breath that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. My son-in-law leaned forward slightly, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp with expectation. My daughter sat unmoving, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on the folder, as if staring hard enough could change the words about to be spoken. I remained as I had been all along, quiet, composed, watching. Then the lawyer lifted a single page from the folder and held it up. "On this document," he said, "is the signature of the founder." His voice was deliberate, weighted, as though even he felt the gravity of the moment. He turned the sheet so that all could see, and there it was, my name, written in ink, stretched across the bottom of the page with the calm certainty of a man who had not rushed, who had not wavered. It was not a shaky line of old age, nor the hurried scratch of a hand coerced. It was steady, measured, exact, like the road I had laid for them all those years, a road paved with my labor, my silence, my choices. The room shifted in that instant. My daughter's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes flickered toward me, and for the first time in many months, I saw not dismissal, not avoidance, but recognition. My son-in-law's face darkened, his confidence cracking like dry earth beneath weight it could not carry. His hand twitched against the arm of his chair, as if he might protest, as if his voice could rise louder than ink. But no sound came. The lawyer continued, his tone still neutral. But the words he read were sharper than any rebuke I could have delivered. Attached to the trust was an appendix, a list written with precision, one name after another, chosen not by bloodline alone, but by action, by character, by loyalty, those who had cared, those who had carried weight without asking for reward, those who had shown respect, not in speeches but in deeds. Each name was spoken aloud, echoing in the silence of the office. Each name was a reminder that family is not defined by arrogance, but by sacrifice. And then came the space where his name should have been, the son-in-law who had mocked me, who had cornered my daughter into silence, who had treated my presence as a burden. He was not there. His absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. The lawyer did not pause for him. He simply moved on, reading the next name, the next rightful heir of responsibility, as though the omission was not even worth commentary. I felt no triumph in that moment, no joy, only the deep, steady confirmation of justice long prepared. My signature had spoken, and it spoke more loudly than their laughter, more loudly than their demands, more loudly than the slammed doors and the accusations. My hand, years earlier, had already answered every insult, every dismissal. That ink carried a voice no storm of arrogance could drown. I sat there, my hands folded quietly on the table, and let the sound of my own name, etched in their future, not in their control, settle into the room. The lawyer's reading continued, but I barely heard him now. All I heard was the silence of those who had once shouted me down, now forced to sit beneath the authority of a signature they could not erase. It was not anger that filled me. It was not revenge. It was a calmness so deep it felt like the earth itself had risen to hold me steady. My name, written long ago, had become more than ink. It had become a verdict, a boundary, a voice that spoke without needing to shout. And they were listening now, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. The voice of my signature had finally drowned out theirs. It was almost strange to watch them search for their voices and find them suddenly weak. For months their words had been sharp and endless, filling rooms with confidence, smirks, and derision. They had spoken over me at the dinner table, dismissed me in hallways, shouted their plans into phones as though noise itself could build foundations. But now, in the lawyer's office, their volume had turned against them. They tried to argue, yes, but not with me. They argued with the clauses, with the conditions, with the walls they had walked past blindly when they were first laid. Their protests sounded hollow. My son-in-law leaned forward, his voice rising, pointing at the page as if the ink might bend beneath his insistence. He demanded explanations, tried to twist words into new shapes, as though anger could become law. But the lawyer's eyes did not move from the document. His finger remained steady on the lines already written, his voice unshaken. This is what it says. This is how it stands. Each repetition was another wall closing around their desperation. My daughter's voice joined in, softer but fractured, her words tangled in emotion. She tried to argue that things had changed, that intentions mattered more than conditions. But intentions were not signatures. Intentions were not ink that had dried years before, and the paper, unyielding, did not bend to her tremor. She too found herself speaking against something immovable, her pleas fading into silence as the reality pressed closer. I did not move. I did not speak. I had no need. My voice was already on the page, steady and calm, dated and signed in a time when they believed I was irrelevant. Now that same voice, preserved in law, outlasted their shouts. Justice does not require volume. It requires permanence, and permanence was already in the ink. As they spoke, their words clashed with the unbending truth, falling to the floor like stones against iron. Each attempt left them smaller, more exposed. My son-in-law's frustration became a tremor in his hands, his earlier confidence unraveling with each clause that denied him. My daughter's protests dissolved into whispers, and then into silence, her eyes filling with the weight of choices she had allowed others to make for her. The silence that followed their shouting was heavier than any noise they had ever made. It was the silence of walls closing in, the silence of realization, the silence of truth that no longer needed defense, and in that silence, justice revealed itself. Not as triumph, not as revenge, but as inevitability. I remained still, my hands folded, my gaze fixed not on them, but on the space beyond the window. The trees outside swayed gently, their roots unseen, their strength unspoken, and I thought of how justice is much the same. It does not shout, it does not demand recognition, it simply waits, calm, patient, certain until the day comes when even the loudest voices fall silent before it. When the lawyer closed the folder, the sound was final. They had nothing left to say. No argument remained, no loophole left to exploit. Their noise had run its course, and now only silence remained. A silence not of peace, but of defeat. A silence that made them realize they had never truly been speaking to me at all. They had been speaking against the truth, and the truth had already won. I did not gloat. I did not lift my head with pride. I only breathed, steady and deep, as one who had carried a burden for too long finally sets it down. They had thought their noise could erase me, but noise is temporary. Ink is not. And now, in the silence after their shouting, they finally understood that justice had been written long before they had tried to rewrite it. There comes a moment when legacy must pass from one set of hands to another, not as a gift to be celebrated, but as a burden to be carried with reverence. That moment arrived quietly, not with fanfare or applause, but with the turning of a key, the unfolding of a list, and the recognition of someone who had always been near, always steady, always silent in her service. The lawyer's words had silenced the loud voices in the room, but silence alone was not enough. Justice is not only the denial of arrogance, it is also the recognition of devotion. And so the folder turned one final time, and the name that emerged was not the name of the man who had mocked me, nor of the daughter who had looked away, but of someone who had never sought a place in the center at all. She was the one who had brought medicine when the nights grew heavy, who had noticed the fine print in letters that others dismissed, who had sat with me when the pipes groaned and the light flickered, her hands steady, her eyes patient. She had never demanded, never mocked, never assumed she was entitled to anything. Her loyalty was quiet, her work invisible, but her presence had always carried weight, and that presence was now recognized in ink, not because of her bloodline, but because of her character. The lawyer read her name aloud, and for a moment even the air seemed to pause. She did not gasp or boast. She did not sit taller or let her pride spill into the silence. Instead, her face lowered, her expression solemn, as though she understood immediately that what she had been given was not a crown, but a burden. The trust was not simple inheritance. It was responsibility woven into paper, funds earmarked for scholarships so that children without means could walk paths my own blood refused to see, money directed toward repairing the small clinic in town, where broken bodies needed healing more than my children needed vacations. Resources preserved for the upkeep of the house, not for its sale, not for its division, but for its preservation as the roof under which our family's story had been written nail by nail, beam by beam. As the conditions were read aloud, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders and settle onto hers. And though my heart ached to place such a task upon her, I also knew it was just. Because legacy is not meant for the loudest. It is meant for the most faithful, those who understand that wealth is not possession but stewardship, that power is not entitlement but duty, that family is not about who shouts the hardest, but about who remains when all others turn away. My son-in-law's face darkened, his jaw set in anger, his hands gripping the chair so tightly the wood groaned beneath him. My daughter looked stricken, torn between loyalty to him and the silent acknowledgement that this outcome was fairer than anything else could have been. But neither of them spoke. They had already spent their words, already emptied their voices into arguments that carried no weight. Now there was nothing left but to listen. The keys were symbolic yet real. They would be placed in her hands not as trinkets of authority, but as reminders. The key to the safe that held the trust's documents, the key to the clinic's renovation fund, the key to the very house where we all sat in that moment. She did not clutch them with greed. She accepted them as if they were heavy, as if they carried the weight of every sacrifice that had brought us here. And in truth, they did. I looked at her then, and she looked back, not with triumph, not with gloating, but with quiet understanding. She knew what was being asked of her. She knew that this inheritance was not wealth to be spent, but duty to be carried. And in her steady gaze I saw the reflection of something I had almost forgotten. Hope. The loud had fallen silent. The proud had been humbled, and the one who never demanded, who never mocked, now carried the burden of keeping what mattered alive. It was not a victory. It was justice, drawn in ink, signed in my hand, and sealed in her humility. And in that moment, I understood. Legacy is not the passing of riches. It is the passing of responsibility. And it had found the right hands. The evening came slowly, as if the day itself did not wish to let go of its weight. The house was quiet, finally emptied of voices that had once echoed through it with arrogance and demands. The arguments had burned out like a fire that had consumed its own fuel, leaving only smoke in the air. And so I stepped outside, onto the porch where the wood was weathered but steady, and I sat in the fading light. The sky was deepening into shades of gold and blue, and the wind stirred softly, carrying with it the smell of earth and memory. I sat with no papers before me, no voices pressing me, no demands to sign or argue, only the evening, only the wind. It rustled through the trees, lifting the leaves and sending them drifting like pages turned by unseen hands. And in that sound, I heard the story of my own life, chapters written in labor, in silence, in patience, each one carried forward, not by shouting, but by steady steps no one celebrated at the time. The wind moved as though it were turning the past itself, letting me glimpse each page before it was carried away. I saw my hands building the house board by board, Even as they laughed at its old paint and creaking hinges, I saw my signature pressed firmly into the trust, long before anyone thought to notice. I saw the unsent letter in the drawer, the words I never gave them, but which shaped me nonetheless. I saw the nights of repairs, the drops of water on my skin from a leaking roof, the smell of dust and rust as I tightened bolts and hammered nails. None of it glamorous, none of it loud, but all of it necessary, all of it mine. And now, after all their noise, their shouting, their laughter at my silence, it was these things, quiet things, patient things, that had carried the truth forward. My son-in-law, loud and insistent, was left with empty hands, his arrogance unmasked as hunger that could not feed itself. My daughter, torn and silent, had seen the cost of turning away from what was steady, and the one who never demanded, who never mocked, had received not wealth to waste, but responsibility to bear. Justice had not chosen the loudest, it had chosen the most faithful. I did not smile with triumph. Triumph is too small a word for moments like this. What I felt was deeper, steadier, a quiet confirmation that the long path I had walked, the path of patience, of foresight, of refusing to bend even when mocked, had reached its end exactly where it was meant to. Advice, I understood now, is not force. It is not control. It is a map offered freely. Some will follow it and arrive. Others will laugh, tear it up, and lose themselves at the crossroads. And when they do, it is not the map that failed them. It is their refusal to read it. The wind lifted again, brushing across my face, cool and calm, and I thought of my signature. A line of ink on paper, yes, but more than that. It was my voice when they silenced me, my memory when they mocked me, my strength when they mistook me for weak. That signature spoke now louder than their laughter, louder than their demands, louder than all the noise they had poured into the house. It spoke without raising its tone. It spoke because it had been prepared long before, sealed in calm when no one was listening. And that was the true face of justice. Not vengeance, not triumph, shouted into the night, but quiet inevitability. It had come not with thunder, not with punishment, but with a simple truth revealed at last, that patience outlasts pride, that silence remembers, and that preparation is stronger than arrogance. I sat on the porch until the stars began to prick through the sky, my hands resting still on my knees, the wind carrying away the last traces of noise that had once filled this place. I did not need to look back into the house, nor imagine what they were saying now. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that the truth had stood, steady and unbroken, and from that day on, my signature would continue to speak. Louder than words, louder than shouts, louder even than silence. It would remind them, and me, that justice does not need anger to arrive. It only needs to be written, prepared, and trusted to stand when the moment comes. The night deepened, and I sat in the quiet, knowing the story had ended not with noise but with the quiet strength of a truth that could not be erased.